The parsha starts off by saying how Hashem appears to Avram Avinu as Avram is at the door of his tent on the very hot day. Avram Avinu lifts his eyes and he sees three people standing there, and he runs towards them, bows down, and then the pasuk says, "Vayoymar Adonai imno motzasi chen beinecha al nosaver me'alavdecha." It is this second word of the pasuk, which sounds like Hashem's name, which we're going to be discussing in the Sicha, whether in fact it's Hashem's name or means masters. We're just going to be referring to that word as Adnai. So again, Vayoymar, Avraham Avinu says, my master, Adnai, if I find favor in your eyes, please don't pass by. And then it says, he speaks to the people to take some water, wash their feet, etc., etc., etc. So the Rebbe starts off the Sicha by saying, on the pasuk Vayoymar Adnai imno motzasi chen beinecha al nosaver me'alavdecha, Rashi quotes the words Vayoymar Adnai imno v'goymer and explains L'godel shebehem Omar. He was speaking to the elder or to the leader of this group, and he's calling them all Adonim, calling them all my masters. But it is to the elder that he's saying, Al nosaver, you don't pass by, don't keep on going. Once you stay behind, your friends will stay as well. Rashi says, if we interpret it in this way, then this word, Adnai, is not Hashem's name, but rather it's choil, it's a mundane, it's a regular word, meaning masters. Then Rashi explains a second pirush, as we will soon see. But first, the Rebbe asks on this pirush. And the Rebbe says, Rashi started off by saying, L'godel shebehem Amar, that he's speaking to the leader. That's who he's saying, Adnai imno. He's not speaking to all three people, he's speaking only to the leader. So why does Rashi then immediately say that he's calling them all masters? Then Rashi continues, Dover Acher, another interpretation, Koideshu, that it's actually a holy word, it's a holy name of Hashem. So Avraham Avinu is actually speaking to Hashem and asking Hashem to wait until he runs to bring in the guests. Says Rashi, even though the pasuk had already said previously that he ran to the guests, how could you say that after this pasuk, when it says Vayoymar, he's speaking to Hashem and asking him to wait so that he could run? Says Rashi, really, he had said this before the previous pasuk where he said that he ran. In other words, he had said it earlier. It's just a style of the psukim to speak in this particular way. In other words, sometimes not exactly in the order, the way it happened. Rashi says, as I explained already, on the pasuk Lo Yodoin Ruchi Ba'odam, this is a pasuk in the end of Parshas Bereshis where Hashem is saying that he's only going to give another 120 years to the people to shape up, to do tshuva. Otherwise, he's going to destroy them. He's going to bring the mabul. But now this pasuk says, after the pasuk describes already that Noach had his three children. But the pasuk says that he's going to give 120 years. Noach has his children at a later point. And yet this pasuk says after describing Noach's children already, because sometimes the psukim will be written a little bit out of the order of how it happened. But the Rebbe asks, we need to understand, number one, why does Rashi need to have two pirushim? Why isn't one pirush enough? Number two, why is the pirush, the explanation that the word Adnai over here is choil, does not mean Hashem? Why is that being brought as the first and seemingly the main pirush? And the pirush, the explanation that it's kodesh, is only being brought second. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, since usually the term Adnai is kodesh, is the name of Hashem, so seemingly that would be more pshutei shel mikra. So that pshat, the explanation that it's choil, that the word Adnai over here means different to most of the places, would seem to be further from pshutei shel mikra than the pshat that it's kodesh. So why is the pshat that it's choil coming first and main? And then the Rebbe asks, in the order the way Rashi says things. Rashi first explains how Avraham Avinu is speaking to the malachim, to the elder of them, to the leader of them, etc. And then only towards the end of this pirush, Rashi says, "Ubeloshin zehu choil." That means the word that it's choil, he's only saying at the end of that interpretation. But in the next pshat, when he says that it's kodesh, there he says it right in the beginning. He first says that it's kodesh, and then he explains that he was speaking to Hashem. Why the difference? Now the Rebbe continues with the Rashi, that after both Pirushim, Rashi adds the following words, Ushtei halashonis, both of these explanations are both in Bereshis Rabbah. And the Rebbe asks the following few questions. Number one, why does Rashi have to tell us the source of these Pirushim? Rashi usually does not do that. Number two, when Rashi does bring Pirushim, and he wants to tell us and emphasize that it's taken from Chazal, he will usually bring it in the beginning of the Pirush. So seemingly that's what he should have done here as well. He should have started off Isa beBereishis Rabbah or something like that, and not say it all the way at the end. And finally, the Rebbe asks, in Bereishis Rabbah, in our prints, we actually only have one Pirush. The first Pirush of Rashi, that it's actually Choil. So we must say that Rashi had another Nusach, another version of the Bereishis Rabbah, where both Pirushim are there. As Rashi himself says, both explanations are in Bereishis Rabbah. But the question is, that when we look into our Gemara in Masechta Shavuos, there are both explanations. There are no different versions about it. So why does Rashi bring as his source the Bereishis Rabbah, which will only work according to one specific version of Bereishis Rabbah, and not even a very common version? Why doesn't Rashi just simply bring the Gemara in Shavuos? Says the Rebbe, the explanation of all of this is, after our pasuk that we're discussing, Vayoymar Adnaim Nam Motzasi Chen, etc., Me'alavdecha, immediately in the following psukim, as a continuation of what Avraham Avinu is saying, in other words, it seems like Avraham Avinu is still speaking, the pasuk says, he says, take some water, wash your feet, and I'll bring some bread, you'll satisfy yourself, etc. Now, since there's no separate Vayomer for all of this, it's obvious that Avraham is saying this all as one long flow, one long continuation. And that pasuk, Namotzasi Chen Beinecha, is being said as an introduction to taking the water and the bread, etc., etc. Now, since these following psukim, to take some water and wash your feet, clearly Avraham Avinu is speaking to these people or to these malachim, that's definitely not to Hashem. So the Ben Chamish Lemikra understands that it's obvious that at the beginning of when it says Vayoymar, and again, it only said once, when it said Adnaim no, etc., obviously, that's not being said to Hashem, but it's being said to the three people. And that's why Rashi doesn't have to start off that Pirush by saying that the word Adnai is Choil, because the Ben Chamish Lemikra understands that it's just very obvious in the Psukim. Avraham Avinu is making one statement and he's speaking to the people. The question only is, and this is what Rashi is dealing with, is, why does Rashi start speaking, why is Avraham Avinu, if he's speaking to three people, why is he not speaking in plural, but speaking B'lashon Yachid in singular? If I find favor in your, in singular, eyes, al no saver me'alavdecha, please do not pass from your servant. This should have been said in the plural if he's speaking to three people. And this is what Rashi is coming to say, that Avraham Avinu is actually speaking to one person, to the leader of this group. And that's why it's being said, B'lashon Yachid. Are you then going to ask if there are three people standing there? So it's not really very proper to only be addressing and turning to one of them, even if he's the leader. So why is Avraham only speaking to one of them, to the leader? That's why Rashi says that actually Avraham Avinu first called them all Adoinim. He calls them all my masters. In other words, yes, he's speaking, he's going to actually speak to one of them, but when he turns to them, and when he addresses them originally with a title, when he says that term Adnai, before starting to say what he's saying, he first actually addresses or calls them all my masters. But then the question is, if Avraham wants that all three of them should stay by him, why is he just saying it in Lashon Yachid? Why is he saying it in singular as if he's only addressing one of them, if he wants them all to stay? And this is why Rashi says that he's speaking to the leader and telling him not to leave, and once he won't leave, then automatically they will stay with him as well. In other words, yes, he does want them all to stay, but by the elder, by the leader staying, then automatically they're also all going to stay. This is the way Rashi understands and explains this part of the pasuk, what's going on. The only problem is that nevertheless, after all of this, it's still not so simple and smooth. Why does Rashi have to why is Avraham Avinu going to be getting the other two people to stay by speaking only to the leader? Why can't he just speak to them directly and say, instead of in singular, al nosavru, he could have just said, al nosavru, you should all not pass. And even though their decision is going to be dependent on the leader anyways, in other words, it's not going to be of any benefit to address them, because he's going to be the one deciding. Nevertheless, since the bottom line is, when he says al nosaver in singular, it's possible to think that maybe Avraham Avinu is not including them, Therefore, he should have included them and should have said al nosavru. So in other words, bottom line is it's still not so smooth why it is that he's speaking all in singular only to one person. And this is why Rashi is bringing the second pirush. Davar achar, another pshat, koideshu, that it's actually a holy name. He's speaking to Hashem. And when he says Adnai, Imno, etc., he's not speaking to the three people as an introduction to telling them to take water and wash their feet, etc., but rather he's speaking to Hashem, asking Hashem to wait for him until he runs and brings in the guests. However, says the Rebbe, but this pirush is only being brought as second pirush. That means it's further or it's less fitting with Pshuti Shal Mikra than the first one. Because number one, again, because we said that right afterwards it says Yukach Namat Maim, and it does not say again Vayomer, it seems quite obvious that the first Vayomer, Al Nosaver, was being said to the same three people who are later going to be taking the water and washing their feet. Number two, it doesn't really sound reasonable to say that when Hashem is standing there by Avraham Avinu, Avraham should be running off to the guests and leave Hashem behind, and certainly it doesn't seem right to ask Hashem to wait for him. Just want to point out that in the Ha'ara over here, in the footnote over here, the Rebbe brings the Gemara, the famous concept that from here we see that Achnas HaSorchim is greater than Kabbalas Pnei Shechina. So in other words, you could have argued right over here that that's the point that Rashi is making as well. But the problem with this is that Rashi doesn't mention any of this at all about Achnasas Orchim being greater than Kabbalas Pnei Shechina, and therefore back to Pshuti Shal Mikra, it doesn't seem right that Avraham Avinu would leave Hashem waiting and go to the Orchim. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, as soon as the Malachim came, Shloisha Anoshim Nitzavim, one of these Malachim came to heal Avraham. Says the Rebbe, it makes sense to say that Avraham Avinu immediately became cured, even before he brings them in, because the healing of a Malach doesn't have to take time. Now, since Vayero Elav Hashem, since Hashem appeared to him, as Rashi says, was to come and visit the sick, so once the Malachim came and Avraham is healed, there's really no reason anymore that Hashem should sort of still be remaining. So why is Avraham Avinu even asking him to wait? And therefore, says the Rebbe, because of all of this, Rashi puts this pirush that Avraham Avinu is speaking to Hashem only as second pirush. Because according to this pirush, there are more and more questions and more difficult questions than the problem with the pirush that Avraham Avinu is just speaking to the elder of the Malachim, the leader of the Malachim. Says the Rebbe, according to this, we could also understand why the words Beloshin Zehu Choil Rashi puts only at the very end of the first pirush. And when he says that it could mean Kodesh, Rashi puts it immediately at the beginning of the second pirush. So the Rebbe says, again, because from the simple reading of the Psukim, it's quite obvious that the Vayomer is to all three people. And therefore, in the first pirush, where the Chiddush is only that he's speaking to one person, to the Gadol, Rashi doesn't have to start off with the words that Hu Choil, because again, that's not the main point of his Chiddush. But since, as we said, it's not so smooth, it's not so simple to say that this term Adnai is being used regarding a person, so therefore Rashi, at the end of the Pirush, says, that in truth, Adnai over here is different to the way it usually is. But in the second Pirush, Rashi starts off immediately with saying Koideshu. Why? Number one, because to say Adnai over here is a holy name, it's a name of Hashem. That's a chidush, that seems to be a bit of a novelty. Because I said before, from the flow of the psukim, it really sounds that he's speaking to people. And number two, as a proof, as a basis for the fact that Avraham Avinu is speaking to Hashem, and not as it sounds simply that he's speaking to the people. The basis for all of this is because of that name Adnai, because it's not the regular meaning of Adnai usual, so we want to translate Adnai meaning Hashem, so that's the basis for the explanation that he's speaking to Hashem, and that's why Rashi starts off immediately saying, number one, it's Kodesh, in other words, to emphasize that this is the proof that he's speaking to Hashem, and then Rashi goes ahead and explains, what would it mean if he's speaking to Hashem? He's telling Hashem, please wait while I call the guests. Says the Rebbe, since bottom line is that both Pirushim, both of them, not only are they not so smooth and simple, but they're also quite distant from pure pshat. This is why Rashi has to add, Ushtei halashonis, but Bereishis Rabbah, that they're both coming from the Medrash. that the source of both Pirushim is in Medrash, but it's a kind of Medrash, as Rashi uses in other places, that sort of helps us understand the Psukim. And this is why Rashi says, at the very end of the Pirush. We ask, why doesn't it say in the beginning? Because it's only after we learn through both Pirushim and we understand that they're quite distant from pure Pshat. So Rashi then has to sort of tell us that in fact they come from the Medrash. According to this, we also understand why Rashi says that they're both from the Medrash rather than quoting it from the Gemara. Because specifically by saying it's coming from Medrash, it emphasizes that this is an Aggadah, that this is more of a Midrashic type of interpretation, as opposed to Gemara, where in fact many things that are learnt out from the Psukim also fit very well according to the Pshat, the simple meaning.